Now, he published another book titled How to Grow a Navy, The Development of Maritime Power. I believe it's currently being published by Routledge. So without any further ado, let me invite Professor Till for delivering his presentation. Please.
Thank you very much. And good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everybody. Right, okay. I have been asked to talk about maritime strategy, what it means, how it is developing, and how can maritime power be grown and deployed. In brief, I regard maritime strategy as little more than the way countries seek to achieve their national objectives by what they do at and from the sea. The centrality of the sea is a defining characteristic of the maritime approach, as Julian Corbett reminded us. This definition, of course, is very vague, but that is as it should be, because the form that maritime strategy takes and how it is put into practice depends very much on the context and the circumstances, and these are changing all the time. When the first edition of my Seapower book came out in 2007, it was the high tide of globalization, and many experts anticipated a slow decline in the power of the nation state and of the strategic importance of the quarrels between them. The more countries trade with each other, the less they seem likely to fight. World development seemed to be reflecting the central importance of sea-based trade, from which the peace and prosperity of all countries benefited. Since this seemed to be the case, the logical response was for the world's navies to come together in order to defend a system on which they all depended. This led to the concept of the postmodern navy, namely one that would focus most of its efforts and attention on cooperation with others in order to defend the system against whatever threatened it. Whether that threat took the form of maritime crime of various sorts, natural disasters, international terrorism, or threats that derive from local instabilities ashore, as of Somalia, for example, or indeed the malign actions of rogue states. The supreme expression of this was the cooperative strategy for 21st Sea Power produced by the United States Navy in 2007. This did not mean that peer competition between navies and the traditional naval focus on sea control and that could result in fighting at sea had gone away, merely that it was becoming somewhat less important overall in shaping the size and composition of fleets. Generally, their priorities seem likely to shift towards more low-intensity action against non-state actors at sea and the conduct of expeditionary operations designed to resolve instability ashore in collaboration with their allies and partners. However, the following year, 2008, Russia invaded Georgia, and the Great Recession began to undermine faith in the future of globalization. Since then, a rather different kind of world has appeared, largely shaped by three elements. First, there may be a decline in globalization, but it is still one world. An increasing range of familiar military technical developments like long-range precision missiles, new threats such as cyber and space, plus other non-military issues that derive from globalization, like supply chain vulnerabilities, have led to something of a decline in the insulating effect of geographic distance. Environmental and pandemic worries reinforce the point. Everywhere is affected by everything that happens everywhere else. So countries are bound to be more global in their approach, whatever the state of globalization. Second, it's a more polycentric world, much less dominated by the United States than it used to be. This is not just because of the shift in relative distribution of global power, not least at sea, but it's also because nations, and sometimes groups of nations, are searching for more strategic autonomy and going it alone. The faith in overall collective solutions may be in decline, an impression perhaps sadly underlined by our experience of the COVID epidemic. In consequence, nations seem concerned to develop more individual policy options. Diplomatically, we see a growth in the number of mechanisms and different ways of partially collaborating with each other, so countries can pick and choose military and political options more freely. AUKUS, the Quad, the great number of economic groupings in the Indo-Pacific and Southeast Asia are all examples of this. Third, it's a more competitive world in which the importance of the individual nation state, far from declining, as so many of us expected 20-odd years ago, is actually growing. Despite the benefits of free trade and globalization, and the urgent demands of COVID and the unfolding climate crisis, there seems to be something of a baffling return to visions of old-style realpolitik and spheres of influence thinking that is clearly on display in the South China Sea and the Ukraine. More and more, we could be moving into what some scholars call a classic security dilemma, where the responses of the one side to what it thinks the other is doing makes the situation worse for both of them, and where conflict becomes more likely. The costs and the risks of military conflict, though, are now so high that we can see acute competition between nations moving into new dimensions, such as economic pressure and the weaponization of trade, cyber attacks, so-called grey zone tactics, and so forth. So, what do all these changes mean for navies and maritime strategy today? I will conclude with a brief look at some of the results of this, which will, I hope, also begin to open up some of the specific questions that you have asked me already. The first thing to say is that the deteriorating international context has led in the Atlantic and Indo-Pacific theatres to something of a shift away from the postmodern and back to the modern approach in naval development, despite the growth of maritime crime, environmental crisis, and other such common problems. The modern approach is much more focused on peer competition, the struggle for sea control, and the traditional doctrines, if you like, of naval thinking. Nearly all navies preserve a mix of the two, the modern and the postmodern, but there has nonetheless been quite a shift from the postmodern to the modern. To dig deeper, I'd like to remind you of one very common way of looking at the roles of navies. The triangular approach that we find, for example, in current Australian maritime doctrine. This distinguishes between three different roles. The constabulary, where we're looking just to maintain good order at sea off the coast. The diplomatic, where we're using naval power as an instrument of diplomacy. And the military, which is the war-fighting function of navies. I think it's time we moved on from this, but for four related reasons, all of which reflect the changing context that I've talked about. Firstly, it ignores the very important role that naval development can play in developing the nation. It does this by encouraging the creation of a maritime defence industrial base, which spins off many benefits to the economy as a whole. It is a valuable means of educating and training future generations, who once they have left the Navy, will lead and contribute to the national economy. And navies encourage a maritime consciousness in society and the government, and of the need to take the sea more seriously. In short, maritime strategy is about much more than developing a navy. It has to incorporate the civilian side too, the fishing industry, shipbuilding, ship operations in all of its many respects. Activities which in part depend on the success of the Navy, but which help and support naval development as well. It's a two-way street between the naval and the commercial side of maritime power. Secondly, the outward-facing sides of the triangle do not encourage us to focus on the vital importance of integrating the naval and military contribution with all of the other levers of national policy. This NATO formulation of the comprehensive approach makes the point well. Policy, if you like, is the rope, but each strand of the rope is critical and important, and the strength of it all comes through the close integration of each strand, whether it's law enforcement, the infrastructure, the information domain, economic power, political power, social cohesion, or whatever it is. This explains why, in the latest UK doctrine, the emphasis is all upon the integration of military, economic, and political action to achieve effect in today's world. It's the same in the United States, where the Biden administration is working on the concept of integrated deterrence. In short, maritime strategy must not be regarded as a separate issue, but instead thoroughly integrated into the overall national policy. And I think wherever we look in the world, we can see this development happening with the world's navies. Thirdly, the same principle of integration and mutual support has to apply within the military dimension as well. Naval development, first of all, has to be thoroughly integrated with the huge variety and speed of military technical change. Whether we are talking about cyber, space, hypersonics, artificial intelligence, machine learning, unmanned systems, and so forth. Maritime strategy these days has to deal not just with how all of this will affect the size and composition of the fleet, whether, for example, we go for a few large ships or many smaller, even unmanned ones. A maritime strategy also has to include how to ensure continuous innovation, how to make sure that the Navy always stays up with, or possibly even ahead of, military technical development. To do that, it needs to be thoroughly integrated with it. But also, this American version of a battle system illustrates that maritime strategy must now incorporate the new technological domains, which in this case are space and cyber, because of their reliance on all of this kind of thing. But another aspect of integration within the military domain, and certainly one associated with Corbett, is also to ensure that maritime strategy is more than merely naval, and also includes integration and mutual support with the other domains. Sorry, I've advanced the PowerPoint too quickly. Especially air and land, and to ensure that they work together rather than against each other, as so often in the past. Maritime power is therefore inherently joint and will only be effective to the extent that it is joint cooperatively and effectively. Finally, and moving to the diplomatic aspects of naval activity, the triangle approach is all about inputs, not outputs. Corbett emphasized the point that the first task of navies was to ensure the diplomatic effort, and to have a maritime effect that would contribute to the achievement of national objectives. This is the whole point of the exercise. And navies, in their thinking about maritime strategy, in their preparation of their capacity to struggle for sea control, should always be thinking and ultimately justifying not so much about what they can do, but more about what difference they make. So in conclusion, I think that this approach is the one we should have when thinking about maritime strategy as we plunge deeper into the 21st century. First, we have to start by identifying what maritime effect we need to have, and how this maritime effect contributes to meeting national objectives. We need to ensure that the maritime contribution is thoroughly integrated with and being supported by all of the other dimensions of national policy, here and here. Then navies have to analyze how they are to achieve the maritime effect required. And that means balancing between the four groups of roles: national development, the diplomatic activity, naval engagement, constabulary, looking to your waters offshore, participating in the away game by joining in defense of good order at sea in other parts of the world, and of course in its traditional warfighting functions down here. To do that, of course, the answer that particular navies will come up with as to the size and shape of the fleet they construct will reflect their particular circumstances and the strategic challenges they face by virtue of the country's nature, the regional and global context, and not least, the country's geographic position. I expect the Korean aspect of all of this will be a major part of our discussion, and I look forward to your questions. Thank you very much for your attention.
Oh, Professor Till, thank you so much for your expertise, we just revealed in your presentation. I believe it was a very good opportunity for all audiences today to be able to learn a lot on the changing concept about maritime strategy in general and newly changing roles of Navy in post-modern world in particular. But I think there will be more we can still learn from you through a Q&A session we are going to entertain from now on. So let me ask a first question on behalf of today's audiences. So when we come to strategic concept, we have to consider goals, ways, and the means. So can you tell us the future direction of the development of ROK's maritime strategy in terms of its goals and the ways and the means?
That, Dr. Chung, is a big question. I would say that I do support the ends, ways, and means approach. I know that in some circles, there is some hesitation these days about doing that on the basis that it sounds too mechanistic. In other words, it tends to depend too much on the assumption that if you do this, then that happens. It's too kind of predictable, too orderly, too logical, that in many ways, how the world develops is less logical than that. There are things that happen that are messier that shouldn't follow from this, but somehow seem to. But for all of those criticisms, I still think the ends, ways, and means approach is an effective one, not least because it does focus very much, as Corbett said we should, on what effect it is that we want to have. What do we want to achieve? And so establishing clear, sustainable, and reachable objectives has to be the first part of the consideration. Now, in Korea's case, and I hesitate to make a point to a Korean audience who will know far more about this than I do, that Korea faces the same kind of basic question as quite a few other leading countries of the world do. And that is the extent of where they are going to focus their attention and how they are going to distribute their effort between the various kinds of naval roles that I've identified before. In Korea's case, it seems to me that there are two or maybe three basic choices to be made at the national level, the level of policy, where objectives are being discussed and agreed. And those are, first of all, to concentrate on the very local threat proceeding from North Korea, to effectively focus, if you like, on peninsular defense. The second choice is for the Korean Navy to participate more actively than it has done in the past on the regional security situation, particularly in Northeast Asia, but possibly a little wider than that as well, to take into consideration Chinese policy, Japanese policy, what's happening in the South China Sea, as well as the East China Sea, and so forth. And the third choice, of course, is to adopt a more global approach, and therefore to embrace, to some extent, more and more of the concept of the postmodern Navy, where the Korean Navy is used as an instrument by which Korea has the kind of global effect and influence on global events that its economic development, I think it's about the 8th biggest economy these days, would seem to warrant and justify. Now, the point of identifying these 3 policy objectives is that they all have different requirements in the composition and deployment of the fleet. Quite clearly, if you're anticipating a major role for the Korean Navy at a distance, then you have to have components of your fleet that can operate at a distance. And that will mean ships with, if you like, long legs with very high levels of endurance that can be supported by supply ships of one sort or another. They may well constitute one of the biggest reasons for developing carrier aviation, for example, so that your forces operating at a distance can operate under their own organic air cover, if you like. It may also warrant a program of deployment, of naval engagement, in other words, that is designed to keep their Korea informed about what is happening around the world, to maintain as much of a forward presence as Korea's interests demand. And that means a high emphasis on port visits, on exercises with allies and partners in possibly very distant areas. Now, all of those requirements of preparing for a global role as the maritime contribution to national policy objectives are distinctive to some degree. They do imply that the effort devoted to that can be less devoted to the other 2 roles, the regional and the local. And so that brings us back to this fundamental issue, I think, and that is that all navies, the Korean Navy included, faces the constant dilemma of choice. Choice between what it actually has to do and the relative distribution of effort between those 4 roles that I mentioned. That choice is, if you like, kind of implicit in the objectives that the country has, the policy ends that the country has. And that's one reason why I think navies need to be thoroughly integrated with the overall national effort, so that they can both understand what national policy is and, importantly, contribute to it, not just in the sense of supporting the objectives that it produces, but also influencing in a proper way the discussion that identifies what national policy objectives are. Because navies, after all, are the main source of information and experience about the naval side of things, and therefore their contribution to the government making up its policy mind about what its ends are is very important and needs to be taken seriously. And so for all of these reasons, it seems to me that the ways, ends and means approach is thoroughly consistent. It encourages local thought about the connections between what you do and what you need, and justifies the kind of integrated approach that I've talked about. I hope that answers the question.
Well, thank you so much for the very compelling and very persuasive view you expressed right now. I think it's very much, it can help Korean rank Navy planner and the other strategists to design and execute maritime strategy. I think it's really helpful. And also, it's my personal view. You have already read my mind, because it's the second question I want to ask regarding the first question is about the aircraft carrier and even the nuclear powered submarine, because it has been reported through the media that the Royal Navy will acquire aircraft carrier and even the nuclear powered submarine. So in the case, there are lots of debate on these issues. So the question I want to ask about this issue is, do you believe if we have those assets by Royal Navy, will be inviting arms race from neighboring countries?
That's a very interesting question. And the role of the aircraft carrier in particular is, if you like, almost at the center of so many different debates at the moment. And you've raised one of them. I'll talk about that, but I'll talk about some of the others as well, if I may. The carrier, as if you like, in some ways, only in some ways, is the supreme expression of what navies can be, what navies can do, and kind of reflect really some of the essential characteristics of the debate about what form that maritime strategy should take, not just in Northeast Asia, but everywhere. So let me address the question you asked first of all. Is it going to encourage, along with investment in the nuclear-powered submarine, a naval arms race? Well, no, not necessarily. I don't think that it will, but I would preface my remark by making a distinction between a naval arms race and a process of naval modernization, which might be, to an extent, competitive. I do think that one country in a particular region developing one of these assets, an SSN or an aircraft carrier, is likely to be responded to by other countries in that same region, with which, to some extent, it may be competing. So there is a kind of copy effect. And so another stage of another country may follow with its own development of a carrier or an SSN if the first country in a region develops one. And you can then have a kind of process of parallel naval modernization, which to some extent is a competition. But here is the critical point. It doesn't necessarily follow that that naval modernization process of two countries or three or four or whatever it is proceeding in the same direction in the modernization of their navies is necessarily destabilizing. And that is the essential point of an arms race. Naval modernization is only naval modernization only becomes a naval arms race when it is destabilizing. And you can indeed argue that naval arms races themselves aren't always destabilizing. We all know about the naval arms race between Britain and Germany before the First World War. And many historians, but by no means all of them, would argue that that made an important contribution to the start of the First World War. Okay, so in that case, a naval arms race was destabilizing. It did make stability more difficult. It made conflict more likely. But then think about the 1930s, when what you saw was not a naval arms race, when Britain and America in particular did not participate in a process of naval modernization, such as the one followed by Japan and Germany. And you can argue in that case that their refusal to participate in a maritime modernization, a competitive naval modernization process, a naval arms race, in other words, it's their refusal to participate in one that was destabilizing, not their participation in one. So I think we have to be very, very careful about what we mean by a naval arms race. And it only becomes dangerous. It only becomes something that should be avoided if it is destabilizing. And whether or not it is destabilizing depends in very large measure on the policy objectives of the countries involved, not on naval activity itself. And it's only when naval activity reflects aggressive, destabilizing policy objectives that a naval arms race becomes destabilizing. It was a long answer, but it seems to me that weapons are kind of neutral. They only become offensive, destabilizing, dangerous, when informed by policies that require them to be so. The real question is a question about foreign policy objectives, not naval policy, not naval programs per se. It seems to me that basically, from that point of view, military technology, and indeed much military activity in peacetime, is kind of neutral. It all depends on what this is being done for, and that's a critical question. And so, getting back to the carrier, only if a carrier is used in an aggressive way does it start to develop potentially destabilizing characteristics. But that is not the fault of the Navy. That is not the fault of the submarine captain. It's the fault of the policy makers back in the country's capital. I said that you raised a very interesting question as far as Navy's carriers and SSNs are concerned. Perhaps I'll leave it. Perhaps I'll wait for more questions and come back to those wider issues later on.
Thank you for your explanation. Now we can be very clear about distinction between naval modernization and the naval arms race. Next question is a rather difficult question. It's regarding the US and China military confrontation over Taiwan. The reason I ask a question this way is because, as we know, the RK is a US ally. So if there is a US and China military clash just over Taiwan will occur, then what's the best policy option what government can have to choose in this case?
That is a policy question. That is not a naval question, if you see what I mean, because the activity that the ROK Navy would have to engage in the circumstance that you describe, where there is some kind of clash between the mainland and Taiwan, is an issue that is a matter of foreign policy at the highest strategic level. And of course, it's a question that confronts all of the United States' allies and partners, wherever they are. This is also a question very seriously addressed by Australia, even by the UK, and America's allies and partners in Europe, because of their strategic relationship with the United States. They may well come to the conclusion that some degree of support for United States policy in the event of a clash of some sort between Taiwan and China is necessary, because their strategic linkage with the United States has to be defended. And if they don't come to America's support to some extent, then it would be unreasonable for them to expect America to come to their support at some later occasion. So I think the key question is not, if you like, demonstrations of support. It's much more about what form that support takes. And it may well be, in the case of the UK and America's allies in Europe, for example, that would be largely diplomatic. In other words, it would not necessarily, or it might do, but it might not necessarily involve naval activity. For countries nearer at hand, such as Korea and such as Japan, who particularly value and depend to some extent on American naval and military support, I think the question becomes more urgent as to whether and to what degree there should be naval military participation in whatever the United States chooses to do over this clash between China and Taiwan, largely because stability in the whole of the region depends absolutely on what happens in that clash, why it occurred in the first place. What does it tell us about Chinese policy? What does it tell us about the future directions of Chinese policy in the Western Pacific, and how this is likely to impact Japan and Korea and the countries of Southeast Asia and all the rest of it? So depending on the exact circumstances of the clash, why it happened, how it happened, and what its implications are seen to be, it does seem to me feasible that a degree of naval involvement on the part of the ROK and of Japan might, in some circumstances, be required. Over the water in Japan, for example, there is a debate about the extent to which the Japanese Navy will get involved in any such operation. For them, Taiwan is neuralgic for their historical reasons, and because Taiwan sits astride, not astride, but very close to major routes for energy supplies and trade for both Japan and Korea and all of that. What happens in Taiwan and the transformation to the strategic scene that would happen if China, in its words, resumed control of Taiwan, is enormous and would affect everybody. So it's entirely understandable, if you like, that Japan and South Korea would feel the need to get involved. So in all of these ways, the degree of naval involvement depends so much on the particular circumstances of the time. But I can see, for example, reinforcement support in the sense of escort of vessels going to the scene of the action, maybe even participating in kinetic activities. It just depends on the scene. But I think the initial thing to bear in mind is that whatever happens in Taiwan is bound to have an impact. Japan and South Korea are bound to be involved to some extent in the consequences of that clash. They are bound to have to make a policy decision about what to do about that. It's very likely that that will involve naval activity of some sort, but the exact sort of naval activity depends critically on the exact circumstances of the situation. I'm sorry to seem ambiguous, but I think it does absolutely depend on what caused the clash, and in particular at that particular time, and what it seems likely to policymakers in Seoul, in Tokyo, in Washington, in London, think are the consequences of it for their own countries. It depends on what happens, in other words.
Okay, well, could you take a question from ROK Naval Cadet? They like to raise a question. 상학교
Yeah, sure.
질문 대신하세요. Please raise your question.
You're muted.
Oh, they are preparing. Maybe very fresh question from a young cadet.
Hello, sir. Can you hear me?
Yes, very well indeed. Hello to you too.
Good morning, sir. It seems to be around 8 a.m. in the UK.
That's right. Absolutely.
I'm Mishima Hinano, and it was very impressive lecture, especially about the usage of aircraft carrier. So I would like to give you a kind of expected questions about this part. What do you think about the situation among the Asia, and what stance the Korea should take, especially considering the relationship between US, China, and the Ukraine crisis? And the second question is the need of aircraft carrier in Korea. I would like to know that 2 questions about your opinion. Thank you.
Okay. Is it possible to put up the last slide of my presentation, the one I haven't used? Is that possible?
Oh, yeah, please do so.
Can Dr. Kang put it up, or shall I put it up?
Do we have to put it up?
I'll try it. Can you put it up, Dr. Kang?
I'm pulling up the file. Just a second, please.
Yeah.
You said the last file, correct?
Yeah, the one that the matrix at the end. Yeah, that one. Thank you very much. I'd like to put this up to talk specifically about the role of the aircraft carrier. It seems to me that to understand the role of the aircraft carrier around the world and in the Western Pacific as well, you need to think of it in this rather complicated way because of the nature of what a maritime operation is. Now, I'm going to distinguish between, in this matrix, between 2 things. First of all, the level of intensity of the operation, whether we're talking about something perfectly innocent like humanitarian assistance and disaster relief, whether you're talking about stabilization operations, which might involve the use of kinetic force, or whether you're talking about peer competition and peer conflict. So there's a level of intensity between low intensity at the bottom here and high intensity there. So that's one axis through which we need to understand the value of the aircraft carrier. The other axis goes across the top, and that is a question of time. And it's always important to bear strongly in mind that any military operation is a temporal activity. It takes place over a period of time, and because of that, can well change its nature over time. First of all, you have what I call here precursor activities and operations. In other words, this is what happens in what the Americans sometimes call phase zero. In other words, before the shooting starts. It may be activity that's designed effectively to be a deterrent, to stop the shooting starting, if you like. Then there's the main phase of the operation, whatever it is. Let's suppose, for the sake of argument, that we're talking about a war between, I don't know, let's say China and America, for example. This is where you're talking about a whole series of naval operations. And then finally, you have the part that is so often neglected. What happens when the operations stop? What happens afterwards? What is the consequence, and how do you deal with that? All too often, military people do not pay sufficient, and everybody else do not pay sufficient attention to this. Now, what this produces is a matrix. And it seems to me that you need to discuss the role of any particular naval weapon in line with this matrix. So let's take the aircraft carrier, for example, and what the arguments are about it. You can argue, for example, that the aircraft carrier might be considered overkill for humanitarian assistance and disaster relief operations, that they're not necessary for diplomatic activity because you can conduct perfectly good port visits and participate in exercises without them. But nonetheless, in both respects, it may give you some advantage. Whether that advantage is sufficient to justify spending the very large sum of money that getting an aircraft carrier warrants might be considered debatable. The same might go for this, where you're talking about stabilization operations earlier on. But on the other hand, you can argue that an aircraft carrier is a strong indicator of support, that it's a sort of political statement that might be very effective, and the mere presence of an aircraft carrier therefore might be an important deterrent, because it, not so much of what it can do, but as what it represents as a political commitment. So you can argue here, for example, that the aircraft carrier might be very important indeed. Then you can move to this, the operations stage. During the last phases of the Cold War in Europe, for example, there developed, not least in the UK, the concept of the precursor operation. In other words, we did not expect aircraft carriers to go north of the Greenland, Iceland, UK gap until the Soviet threat of land-based bombers and nuclear-propelled submarines had been reduced to a manageable extent. In other words, aircraft carriers would be more important in the second stage of the operation than they would in the first, because in the early stages of the operation, the main accent would be on getting sufficient sea control against submarines and land-based aircraft for the carrier to operate in with reasonable security. But once the aircraft carrier was there, it would be able to participate in strikes ashore that could make all the difference. So what I'm trying to say by all of this is that the answer to the value of an aircraft carrier is something that you have to bear in mind when looking at these two avenues. First of all, the question of time, when and what is taking place, and secondly, in the question of the extent of the intensity of the naval operation. Now, coming to the situation of the role of the aircraft carrier in the Western Pacific, as you all know, this is controversial. It's bound to be controversial because aircraft carriers are extremely expensive. Naval budgets are finite. Therefore, the more money you spend on an aircraft carrier, the less you've got available for everything else. And there is a school of thought that says that basically it will be better to spend the money on something else. And you can divide this school of thought that says we'd rather spend the money on something else, again, into two categories. One of them says what we need to do is to spend money down here, because these are the kind of things that create stability. And stability means there isn't going to be a war anyway. And so that's the essential thing. So what we ought to concentrate on is a different kind of role. The second school of thought that's skeptical about spending on aircraft carriers says that technology has moved on. Large floating targets like aircraft carriers are too vulnerable these days. And because of that, we shouldn't invest in them. They're vulnerable to carrier-killing ballistic missiles. They're too vulnerable to submarines. They're too vulnerable to other forms of attack, like mine warfare, etc., etc., etc. And so we shouldn't spend on them as well. The other argument that says, yes, we must spend on aircraft carriers says that, yes, some of that may be true, but we either have to deal with those precursor threats first, and then the aircraft carrier comes into full play in this stage of the game rather than that, or much more confidently and a bit more like the American Air Sea Battle Group thought, we can actually cope with those precursor military threats in the operational phase anyway. So there you are, you have a whole range of opinions depending again on the exact context, on the exact circumstances of what you think is going to happen and what you think your naval effect needs to be. So I'll stop sharing now, and no, I can't because I'm not doing it myself. I think we've probably finished with that, Dr. Kang. We can stop that. So what I'm trying to say is that the question of the importance of the aircraft carrier for any country depends on its answers to all of those issues that that matrix raises. Now, you're going to ask me to be more specific about whether Korea needs one. I would argue that the more Korea thinks of itself as a global player, the more it thinks of itself as making a major contribution to the situation in the region, the more it's going to need an aircraft carrier of some form. First, as a gesture of commitment. Secondly, as a means of contributing military capabilities that only aircraft carriers can deliver. And this would include things like the ability to maintain organic air support for a force operating away and out of range of your land-based air power. It would include the capacity to strike an adversary from an unexpected direction and to maintain that capacity at a distance. However, if Korea decides that the local threat, North Korea, is the only one that matters, then I think the case for the carrier will be somewhat reduced. I'm not sure I would go so far. In fact, I'm pretty sure I wouldn't go so far as to say that it simply gets regarded as a kind of vanity product, you know, something that navies invest in because it looks good, and all navies want big ships as a general rule. I wouldn't go that far, but I think there's more evidence that would support that notion if Korea kind of conceives as its major preoccupation, to the extent of excluding virtually everything else, is its local threat. So again, I come back to this basic point that everything the Navy does, everything that the Navy acquires in forms of platforms, the shape and composition of the fleet, depends absolutely on what the maritime policy objective is. And that's a question that's handled effectively by policymakers deciding what the ends of maritime policy for the ROK Navy should be. So I hope that kind of answers the Korea question. Your other one, more generally, I think is a general question about where the priority should be in the Western Pacific. And I would say that my point about the world getting more competitive, more polycentric, I think is absolutely true of the Western Pacific. It is getting more polycentric because of the rise of the Chinese Navy, because of the extent to which China wants to change things. Perfectly reasonably, you might think, from Beijing's point of view. And the degree to which its policy is seen as threatening the interests of its neighbors, whether it is or whether it isn't. And on all of those questions depends the answer as to how competitive, how modern your Navy in that region needs to be, rather than postmodern, which focuses on good order at sea tasks against maritime criminals and that sort of thing, and expeditionary operations against instability in distant places. So basically, I can see the argument that the way things are going at the moment in the Western Pacific is towards the competitive end of things. And that would seem to justify the navies of the region moving into that area rather more at the expense of the postmodern influences. And to be clear, I think that's what navies are doing. It's certainly what China is doing. It's certainly what Japan is doing. It's certainly what the various navies of Southeast Asia are doing, to the extent that their budgets allow. It is creating a more competitive type of naval modernization, but I don't yet think it's quite become a naval arms race. I don't think it's yet become destabilizing, not seriously, but I think one has to admit that there is that possibility, that it might develop a momentum of its own pointing in that direction. Particularly the case between China and the United States, of course. But the disincentives of engaging in naval activity that has that destabilizing effect, and so does become a naval arms race of the worst sort, is such that at the moment, at least, both sides are advancing their competition more by other means, non-kinetic means, grey zone operations, political influence, economic pressure, than they are through the prospect of imminent military use. Same questions going on, I think, at the moment in the Ukraine, as far as we in Europe are concerned. So I hope that answers both your questions, but I'm not sure if it does. Thank you.
Thank you. Any further question from a Naval Academy, Naval Cadet? No, I believe there's no more question. Next question is, in fact, related to first question I gave you. Just like you said, my first question is a big question, but this question is a very ambitious question. It is from a Navy headquarters, working naval officer. So I will read the question on behalf of him. In your latest edition of Seapower, you mentioned that 5 other domains when you discuss the element of seapower. What role does the Navy play then in space and cyber domain? The second question is seapower refers not only to Navy, Marine Corps, and the Coast Guard, but something more than that. Do you think it is enough for Korea's maritime strategy to be based mostly on Navy, Marine Corps, and the Coast Guard? Now this part is very ambitious. The US Navy has a Navy Department, but Korea is not. So does this difference have an effect on the development of ROC's maritime strategy?
Yes. First of all, on the cyber and space domains, I will put them together. There is no question at all that these new domains of naval activity are critically important, and they may make a fundamental difference to the shape and the composition and the activity of the fleet. They may make for much faster operations. They may create situations where decisions have to be made not in minutes, but in fractions of seconds, which puts more and more stress on the automatic reactions of technology, faster than human beings can cope with, if you like. So I think for navies, the one operational question is the critical one of how can they create cyberspace systems, machine learning, that have algorithms that are so reliable that you can trust them, that you can, if you like, almost hand over some of your immediate responses to situations that arise to machines rather than to the human beings who, until the last 10 years or so, were in a position to actually make those decisions. And so I think the fundamental question, therefore, people, is to how to cope with all of this, how to adapt what you do and how you do it to the new demands and the new opportunities that cyber, machine learning, hypersonics, and all the rest of it offers to you. And so for that reason, I argue that maritime strategy has to include a major contribution and focus on how to innovate, how to keep up with what the Russians call the military technical dimension of warfare. Maritime strategy isn't just about what you do with what you've got. It also has to be about how you get what you need in the most effective way and how you use what you've got in the most effective way. So it's become much more wide. And I don't think that maritime strategy in the old days of sailing warfare, for example, was really had that component to it to the extent that it does these days. And I'd make much the same argument about the question of to what extent should maritime strategy be naval. what Julian Corbett talked about, and I've mentioned him a lot, and I mention him because I think he's, you know, a really thoroughly worthwhile person whose views need to be considered. What he argued was that a country had a maritime strategy that was much more than naval strategy, that was an important part of maritime strategy. And he argued this because military operations in peace and in war were largely shaped by what happened on land and were designed to influence what happened on land. So for that reason, it was inadequate simply to think about what happened at sea. You had to think about what happened in consequence from the sea ashore. And this meant that he was, by definition, determined to argue that naval operations had to be very closely integrated with land operations. And that effectively meant that navies needed to cooperate with armies. They had to support what the armies needed to do, and armies needed to support what navies needed to do. And you could see multitudes of ways in which both of these were possible. And so maritime strategy has to incorporate this relationship between sea power and land power. The two go together. They are not opposites. They're both components of maritime strategy. Now, Corbett wrote his book before the First World War, before air power really came into effect. But it did during the First World War, of course, but even then, only in a starting kind of way. But afterwards, he would certainly have said exactly the same arguments apply to air power as well. So maritime strategy has to incorporate support from the air and land, and support to air and land. And so the interests of the Army and the Air Force have to be taken very seriously, alongside the naval focus, natural naval focus, simply on developing the fleet. And so all maritime strategy, by definition, needs to be joint. They need to work with each other, not against each other, which sadly has often proved to be the case in the past. Partly because of their professional focus on their own domain. It's, you know, silo thinking it's often called, where you focus so much on the complexities of your own particular domain, you're not interested in and sympathetic to people in the other silo who have their own preoccupations. So it can result in uncoordinated development, if you like, where naval development is going one way, air and land development are going in two other directions, and they're not properly coordinated. Even worse, there can be turf battles where you have one service bidding for a bigger share of the defense budget at the expense of the interests of the other two services. And this, unfortunately, is extremely common and in many ways very understandable, but it's against the principle of maritime strategy. The principle of maritime strategy is coordination and cooperation between the various domains, not conflict between them. So that's the difference, essentially, between what I call maritime strategy and what Corbett called maritime strategy, and what he called naval strategy, which is part and parcel of it. And I think the same argument would go when you're looking at naval strategy to Coast Guard activity and marine activity as well, that they too have their own professional interests. They too have to develop a policy, they have to develop a strategy, they have to define their objectives, they have to find ways and means of getting them, they have to make sure that that produces the best marine power you can get, the most effective Coast Guard you can get, but they also have to integrate it with everything else in the maritime domain, in the naval domain first, and then the maritime domain more widely. And even within the Navy, you can see the same sort of thing. It's critically important that the carrier community, which has got tremendous issues to deal with, focuses on that, works out effective policy objectives, works out its ways and means, but also thinks about the interests of the submarine community, or the surface ship community, or the land-based maritime air power community, or whoever it is. You have to always coordinate with other parts of this very widespread concept of maritime strategy, which has to be joint and it has to be coordinated. So that's the essential difference, I think, between maritime strategy and naval strategy.
Oh, thank you. But now it's not. It is the last but not least. Can you tell us something about the UK's tilt toward Indo-Pacific?
Yes, indeed. The first point I would make is that perceptions of it are quite often wrong. It seems to me wrong in two ways. Wrong in the extent to which it's exaggerated. People talk about tilt, and they have in their mind something like a seesaw. In other words, there's a complete and drastic change. I don't think that's actually the way that the government actually thinks of a tilt. I think it thinks of it more in the sense of a bigger emphasis being placed on the Asia Pacific than used to be the case, but not to the extent of neglecting everywhere else. And at the moment, what we're seeing, of course, is a principal focus on what's happening in the Ukraine, where, as you may well have noticed, the UK has been taking quite a leading role in that, because it thinks that what happens on the mainland of Europe is critically important to British security, fairly understandably. And so that is a major preoccupation. And I think it's still the main one as far as British preoccupations are concerned. But nonetheless, there is a profoundly significant tilt towards the Pacific, in the sense of recognizing that what happens in the Pacific is important to Britain, and the rest of Europe too comes to that, because of the economic power there, because of the military situation there, and so on and so forth. And so, as global actors, if you like, Britain and the other Europeans feel bound to get more involved in the Asia Pacific than they used to. Now, this is felt by various European countries more or less strongly. The strongest two are clearly Britain and France. I would say that Germany, the Netherlands, and Denmark are also very interested for all sorts of reasons as well, but somewhat less so than Britain and France. So it's all a matter of degree. That's the point I'm trying to make. It's a tilt in a change of proportion between the focus of effort in Europe, least, the Mediterranean area, Africa, and the Indo-Pacific. It's not a complete change, in other words. The second point I want to make, and I think it's also wrong, is that it's simply the consequence of Brexit. In other words, it's Britain wanting to become a global player because of Brexit, because of having left the European Union. Now, this is absolutely not true. And I would point to the fact that for several years before the vote, before Brexit was even considered a possibility, Britain was already adopting a more of an interest in the Pacific than it had before, and had stated that this was the objective for all of the reasons I've just said, because of the economic weight of the Indo-Pacific, because of the military situation in the Indo-Pacific, and because of the extent to which these two things could well shape British interests and affect British interests. So it's not just a consequence of Brexit and will fade away. It's something much more substantial than that, that derives from a basic British, shared with the Europeans, concept that what happens in the Indo-Pacific has become much more important to them than it used to be. It's here to stay, in other words. And what form it takes, I think we see this year, the same year, well, last year actually, the same year as the Ukraine crisis, effectively, in terms of things like the AUKUS deal, which is a very substantial and significant deal, with the revival of British interest in the five-power defence arrangements in Southeast Asia, with, of course, the cruise of the new aircraft carrier battle group, the first operational deployment in effect of that. But just bear in mind that in that cruise, and this is the last point I will make, even in that, the battle group, when it was moving through the Mediterranean, dispersed some of its units into the Black Sea, and HMS Defender, one of our Type 45 air defense destroyers, went into the Black Sea and participated in an operation clearly in support of the Ukraine claim on the Crimea. And so that same naval presence, if you like, first of all, transmitted a message of support for the Ukraine before resuming its passage to the Indo-Pacific, where it did the same for its allies and partners in the Indo-Pacific region. So that illustrates nicely the point I'm trying to make, that it's a matter of degree, that naval forces can do both, and that they were having a maritime effect that was consciously thought about. Here we will use it for this purpose, and over there in the Indo-Pacific we will use it for that purpose. And that's the value of navies. They can be used in this multitude of ways to support, to deliver maritime effects that support a range of policy options that the government wants.
I think it's time to call it a day. Professor Till, I sincerely regret that the pandemic has prevented us from meeting face to face.
Yeah,
I'm sure today's audiences could great benefit from your lecture, because they all will be able to enhance their understanding of the essence of maritime strategy in general, and the approach to future direction of ROC's naval strategy in particular. So many thanks again to you, and please stay safe and healthy. The fair wind, clear skies, and following seas with you and with your family, with the UK. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. Thank you. It's been a pleasure.
Yeah. Bye.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye-bye.